On October 16, 1793, they led a woman to a machine built for one purpose: final judgment. The crowd, a sea of Parisian rage, roared with approval for her end. They had spent years preparing for this moment. They called her Madame Deficit, the enemy of the people, the Austrian whore. They blamed her for every empty breadbasket, every crippling debt, and every disaster the French state had ever known. But she wasn't killed by the blade. She was killed by a story. A lie so powerful, it transformed a teenage bride into history's most reviled villain. Was Marie Antoinette history's greatest monster? Or was she simply the most spectacular victim of a brilliant propaganda machine? This is the truth behind the lie that killed a queen. When you think of Marie Antoinette, what instantly comes to mind? An image of opulence so extreme it borders on cruelty, and the two most defining damning words in her entire legend: let them eat cake. This single flippant phrase is her entire historical identity. It's the perfect villain statement, a queen so breathtakingly detached from the suffering of her people that when told they were starving and had no bread, her suggested solution was a luxury pastry. It's a perfect story. A symbol of unimaginable arrogance, and it is completely 100% false. Marie Antoinette never said those words. Not only is there zero historical record of her uttering the phrase, but historians have tracked that exact quote to writings by philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, published when Marie Antoinette was a child of only 9 years old. It was attributed to a nameless, generic princess. The problem wasn't that she was cruel. The problem was that the revolutionary fire needed a villain, and this lie was the perfect weapon. This wasn't history. This was propaganda. The problem wasn't a shortage of pastries. The problem was a shortage of legitimacy. When Marie Antoinette stepped onto French soil at age 14, she didn't just bring a huge dowry. She brought the entire bitter history of Austria. Austria was France's traditional enemy. This marriage, a cold, calculated political alliance, was meant to secure peace. But to the French people, she was immediately branded a foreign agent. They refused to even call her by her title, opting instead for the scathing nickname l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, a slur that carried the dual meaning of Austrian bitch. She was isolated. She couldn't speak the language well. She had inherited a court system designed to scrutinize and criticize her every move, especially when she failed to produce an heir quickly. She was trapped in the gilded cage of Versailles, desperate for distraction. But here is the critical historical truth. The financial disaster that would eventually consume her and the monarchy, the astronomical national debt, was not caused by her diamond necklaces. It was caused by decades of devastating, expensive wars, most notably the 7 Years' War and the recent support of the American Revolution. France was fundamentally bankrupt before she ever spent a single livre on a gown. But the citizens couldn't execute the national debt. They needed a person. They needed a face. They needed a symbol of the monarchy's indifference. And for the powerful pamphleteers and revolutionaries, Marie Antoinette, the foreign, vulnerable, and easy-to-despise scapegoat, was the perfect target. Now, let's be perfectly clear. Marie Antoinette was no saint. If she wasn't the villain the revolutionaries created, she was certainly a figure deeply ill-suited for the crisis consuming France. This brings us to the tragic truth of her personal life. She arrived in the gilded cage of Versailles as a young teenager, isolated, constantly scrutinized, and desperately lonely. She failed to produce an heir for years, fueling a torrent of cruel gossip. She needed an escape. Her coping mechanism was simple, expensive, and profoundly reckless: distraction. She became obsessed with elaborate fashion, balloon-sized hairstyles, gambling, and constructing a private world away from the court's venom. She retreated to her infamous private estate, the Petit Trianon. Here, she commissioned the Hameau de la Reine, a rustic fantasy village. This was her bubble, her way of pretending the oppressive reality of court and the mounting national disaster simply didn't exist. But this retreat became a visual symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. Here is the financial reality. Her entire personal spending, even at its most flagrant, the diamonds, the gowns, the construction of her hamlet, accounted for less than 1% of the total French national debt. That debt was driven by military failures. She was a drop in the ocean. But you cannot execute a military budget. You cannot start a revolution against a loan agreement. You can start a revolution against a queen who owns 300 pairs of custom-made shoes while her citizens are fighting for bread. Her extravagance was not the cause of the revolution. It was the easy, obvious fuel that turned simmering resentment into an inferno. As the economy collapsed, pamphlets, satirical journals, and grotesque cartoons began flooding the streets of Paris. This wasn't just political criticism. This was a calculated, industrialized campaign of character assassination aimed at dismantling the monarchy one libelous lie at a time. The stories became exponentially more vile. Beyond just Madame Deficit, she was accused of treason, selling French secrets to the Austrians, and staggering promiscuity, stories designed to paint her as a corrupt foreign disease infecting the purity of the French nation. One infamous scandal, the affair of the diamond necklace, perfectly illustrates how deep the rot went. She was innocent, a victim of con artists, but the public believed she had masterminded a massive fraud to acquire an impossibly expensive necklace purely for her vanity. The monarchy couldn't stop the press, and the scandal permanently destroyed her credibility. But the darkest chapter came during her trial in 1793. When the political charges of treason and conspiracy weren't enough to satisfy the revolutionary tribunal, they stooped to the unthinkable, accusations of incest with her own son. These were fabricated horrors, designed to shatter her reputation entirely and prove to the public that she was not just an enemy of the state, but an enemy of morality, nature, and God itself. The accusations were so shocking that even some of the revolutionary women present in the courtroom were appalled. This was the final, lethal effect of the propaganda machine. It ensured that by the time she faced the guillotine, the person standing there wasn't a queen or a woman. It was a monster of their own creation. The tragic figure of Marie Antoinette is found not in the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles, but in the cold, damp stone of the Conciergerie prison. The lavish, flippant queen the public despised had vanished. Her final months were a systematic dismantling of her very identity. She was stripped of all her dignity and subjected to constant surveillance. Her elaborate wardrobe was replaced by a simple, plain black dress of mourning. Most agonizingly, she was separated from her children, the political goal being to break her spirit completely. When she finally faced the scaffold, she did so with a quiet, almost defiant composure. The mob expected the screaming, arrogant monster they had read about in the pamphlets. They saw instead a woman, stripped bare, walking toward her fate. Her last documented words were not a speech of defiance, but an apology to the executioner, whose foot she accidentally stepped on. It was a final, small flash of the personal grace that the political fury had long obscured. She was 37 years old. The life of excess ended not with a revolution, but with a calculated political execution driven entirely by a hateful public narrative. So, after dissecting the myths, the reality, the spending, and the spectacular hatred, was Marie Antoinette a villain or a tragic figure? The truth, as is often the case in history, is far more complex than a single word. She was neither fully one nor entirely the other. She was a tragic symbol. Her frivolous spending, her distance from the people, and her retreat to the Petit Trianon were genuine mistakes. They were fuel. They made her an incredibly easy target. She was profoundly incompetent in her role as queen during a period of national emergency. But the forces that destroyed her were not about her competency. The forces that destroyed her were the relentless, machine-like efficiency of political propaganda, driven by national debt and widespread starvation. She was the perfect, high-profile sacrifice. The revolutionaries needed a spectacle to justify the seismic shift in power. By focusing all the national rage onto one single Austrian-born woman, they successfully distracted from the deeper, systemic causes of the revolution. Her ultimate legacy is defined not by the luxury she enjoyed, but by the terrible, enduring power of a lie that took a symbol of excess and successfully manufactured a monster. History is full of people trapped between myth and reality. The villain is always easier to remember than the tragic figure. So now I ask you, what historical figure do you think has been most unfairly judged by a powerful myth or relentless propaganda? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone, and your suggestions often become our next deep dive. And if you want more deep dives exposing the truth behind history's greatest misunderstandings, do two things. Hit that like button and tap subscribe. We expose the truth behind the legend every single week.